Hello, let's have a look at the floor to ceiling ball. It's a good piece of equipment, very cheap, and I've been telling people I know for years, maybe even a decade, that they should get one. And if you're going to exercise at home, it's the first piece of equipment you should get, and there's so much you can do with it. You don't have to consider them to be used for fight training. You can do a lot of other things with it, and some people would be put off by that. Some people might say, mostly women, but not necessarily, as soon as they think something's to do with combat or martial arts, it turns them off and they're not very interested in it. Well, you don't have to punch it, you can slap it, you can use it rather like what we used to call a swing ball in England, tether ball in America. Use your elbows, use your knees, do all kinds of things with it. And the advantage of this over a punch bag is that you can hang them up far more easily, not very heavy. You could put them into a beam on your average ceiling without any reinforcement, whereas if you pull a punch bag up, you better do a little bit more work and make sure it can take the weight. You can use a tree, and I've mentioned before that you could use a punch bag to a ladder to hang a lot of things from. With a punch bag, it's a lot of work. I'll get to demonstrating that at some point, but with one of these, it's not very hard. You could use a beam of wood on the top of a shed or on the top of an extension building with a few weights on top of it, and it only has to take 20 or 30 pounds worth of weight to hold it quite firmly. I've got a hook on the floor here, but for a long time I had a couple of cheap concrete weights down there. Eventually the plastic came off from exposure to the sun and I put the hook in, but it worked perfectly well. In fact, you can use weights, and if you use weights that are light enough on the floor, then it will change the pattern of movement and it gives you something else to think about. I've been telling friends to get hold of these for a long time, and I'm not sure that anyone has so far. It doesn't say much for my recommendations, but I thought I'd make this video, and in the future, if I try to persuade people to get them, I could just give them this as an introduction. They've been used for a very long time. I don't think you found them often in the 50s and 60s. You definitely get them in a lot of boxing gyms now. They're not as common as much equipment. I've had people come here to train with me. One friend I think of in particular who has been in boxing gyms, trained in Muay Thai for quite some time, and he didn't know what on earth to do with it, and he said that quite clearly. And then he started throwing haymakers at it, which you can do, but it's not really what it's meant for. It's getting used to movement, giving you a moving target to hit that matters, encourages you to move, and getting a bit more footwork than you would with a heavy bag. Of course, you can move around with a heavy bag, but not as much. This one, for a while, you get this kind for about £25, maybe up to £30. The price of everything is going up at the moment, but you can still get these for £30. You shouldn't be paying £40 for one, definitely not, unless you get a higher quality leather one. And you can even get some cheaper ones, and I'll demonstrate one of those in a while. Now then, I just want to think about casual use for a little while. As I say, a lot of people don't really want to think about boxing very much for exercise. That must be changing, because I think boxercise is fairly popular, but still a lot of people, they hear martial arts and they think about combat and they think that's something they shouldn't be very much involved in. But you can just hit it with the side of your hand, move with it, encourages you to move. Hit it with your head if you like. Get your knees up there, elbows in all kinds of patterns, and you don't have to think of it in combat positioning, trying to guard yourself, unless you want to. You could just decide you're going to do 50 of these, then 50 with your elbow, moving around without ever thinking about punching anybody. Right, if you're going to fight with it, of course, then there's a little bit more to it, and you want to start keeping your guard up and think about this being the person moving. Now, of course, in a real combat situation, you're thinking about their bodies, and that's your target, and you're thinking about their weapons, their fists, feet and elbows. Here you've only got one thing moving around. So in one moment, I'm thinking about it as the body, the target, and then another moment it's coming for me and I'm thinking about it as the fist. What I'm trying to say is nothing simulates combat, fighting, sparring with another human being. Of course it doesn't, but this gives you a lot more to work with than just a heavy bag. You can slip when you punched, you can just spring it at yourself and make sure you move out the way, and you can even use it to get used to the range a little bit. Punch, back. Because it moves like a pendulum, you can chase it. So rather than wait for it to come to you, which of course isn't going to happen often in a fight, I know you get the occasional great knockout when somebody's moving forward and a punch is perfectly well timed, but generally you probably want to chase it. So rather than standing there, this again is if you're using it with a mind to combat training, you have to be careful not to fall into bad habits. For example, it's easy to do this. Let it come to you. That's not much of a punch. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's training you to move in time with something. But you've got to remember that your target isn't going to be quite as cooperative as this is most of the time. So you can hit with it and then chase it when it moves away from you. Sometimes when it's circling quite widely, you can get an awkward uppercut in. I think it was GSP with Michael Bespin. I'm not a fight historian by any means, but I believe that was one I noticed, and he caught him with a long range uppercut that seemed impractical, but it worked. Won the fight for him. What you will find, if you've been hitting it for a while, then you go to the heavy bag, you won't have as much impact on the bag as you used to if you try to hit it like this. You need to remember that's when you're moving in, really pulling, forcing and twisting. You can do that with this. You can give it some hard punches and then it's going to come back faster. One thing I do find is the movement of this encourages my movement, just circling it. It's just something to look at when everything around you is static, as it will be when you're training with our partner. Then this gives you something that's also moving, and I suppose you develop timing with it. And talking about timing brings me on to another subject, which is all the different types. This is a fairly cheap one. It's perfectly good. I haven't used it at length. I used to buy them like this, and I used to leave them out in the sun, and they didn't really get through more than 9 months or so without a puncher. And I quickly found out that when you're punching something all the time, the filler that we use on bike tyres isn't so effective. So when you've got a puncher in the bladder that's inside this, it's really going to be from the bin pretty soon. Actually, that's not entirely true. I've got a bit of a graveyard of them in the corner of my exercise shed, just in case they're ever useful for something. So hanging it up for a long time, leaving it out in the sun isn't a very good idea. It won't last anywhere near as long. Now this comes with a standard hanging method, quite a thin bungee. And as you see, this goes slowly. Now if this was being watched by anyone who spends a lot of time boxing, training in combat sports, they're saying, what are you doing, you wimp? That's too slow. It's not much use. But I started with the idea of encouraging people to exercise without necessarily having a mind to combat sports. That said, sometimes you want more movement. Some of the bigger ones just stay in a very small circle, and that's fine as well, it's very good. But it won't simulate combat in the same way. Of course, I haven't even mentioned you can kick them perfectly well. And that takes timing, almost similar to being a musician. You're waiting for the beats until it's in the right position. I've had them lower as well. Before now I've used cable ties to put another ball on here. When you do that, you've got an hourglass, a strange change in centre of mass as it's going around, and it wobbles a lot, and it wasn't really very easy to kick. See some people talking about punching the bungees. Incidentally, you don't need to wear gloves for one of these, but be wary. If you hit the metal, it can really hurt your knuckles. There's no bracket too close to the board here, but on the ones that do have it, you can do an uppercut, and you can really give yourself a miserable couple of days. There aren't that many circumstances when you do side kicks with them. Of course, you can put it lower if you want. I'm not particularly good at stretching to the side, as you'll no doubt find out as I make more videos. This is the basic type, moves pretty slowly. It's not what I use most of the time. So I'll get a ladder and be back in a second. This is the kind I use most often. It's not very different to the other one. Does away with extension straps. I don't think there's a particular reason for that, it's just the way they chose to make them. Although, as I've already mentioned, when you've got this bit of metal here, you can catch it with an uppercut, and that can hurt. You can pull on bad gloves, or you can just learn you better be a bit more careful, which is never a bad idea in itself. Now then, bungees don't cost very much. Now already it's moving faster. It's nice, I like it more, but then this is the one I'm used to training with on a daily basis, so of course I'm used to its timing, used to where it will be. Don't hit that. You can use as many bungees as you want. You can tie knots in them to get it at just the right height, and sometimes you want them lower. Of course I could take the knotted ones, put them at the bottom, then have it down here and have something for your knees. I wonder if, I don't know much about football, my friends will tell you that, but if somebody who does care about football might find some use to having one lower down and trying kicks at different angles, seeing what that does for them. And then the difference is you don't have to go and get the ball back afterwards. I'm comfortable with this one. It's a little bit tougher, but not too tough. It might just be enough to condition your hands a little bit over a period of time. I used to be one of the people who says you don't hit the heavy bag without gloves, because if you do, you're risking injury that's going to ruin the training. But I don't really agree anymore. My hands have become toughened up over the years, and I think using one of these often is responsible as much as a heavy bag, because I do it a lot, and there's those small impacts on your skin. Just like if you're handling ropes for a long time, you'll get calluses. I think over a period of time, the skin toughens up and becomes used to the impact. Not too heavy in impact, won't do any damage. Now then, another thing worth mentioning is even when you're using one with a mind to combat, there'll be times when you're using it quite specifically as though you had an opponent and you're trying to keep your guard at all times and evade. But there'll be times when you're just using it for fitness, even if you're training with a mind to combat sports. This, of course, is very much like a speedball. I don't have a speedball. I've used them, of course. I don't see a lot of need for one when you can do this. Apart from that, I'd have to put the platform for it up and I'd have to move it around and get in the way. I don't think a speedball does anything for you that this doesn't do. You can use it for patterns like this. Of course, you're not going to fight somebody like this, but it just gets you used to moving your arms around. You try to use some different angles. It's fitness, and it gets you used to having your hands seeking something, and I expect that has something to do with hand-eye coordination, and with these sorts of things, familiarity over a long period of time is always going to be good for your ability. With that in mind, I'll mention I quite like to hit this looking at something else and just looking at the motion in the periphery of my vision, and I think that, I'm not saying it can develop your visual capabilities at all. I don't think you can really work out and improve your eyesight, but it gets you used to hitting it, trying to make sure your hand is in the right place at the right time, even when you're not looking directly at it. And you can gaze up at the rooftops, not at the sun, It's a bit too bright. I think I've seen somebody blindfolded using one of these. I've not tried that yet. I'll give it a second or two with my eyes shut. Not too bad, but I missed it. But you can do that. You can have some fun with it. Let's have a look at just a couple more types. So we've had the cheap basic one. We've had the slightly more expensive leather one. Now, this is interesting for a particular reason, because it's very cheap. I bought this a couple of months ago and I've looked since, and still right now you can get one of these for under £20. It also comes with a couple of tennis balls on elastic. I think that's often called a spot trainer. I've not used them. They're definitely good for fitness. I think even more than something like this. It takes you away from realistic positioning for fighting. And I'm not saying for a minute they don't have their purpose, but it is a fitness toy, a fitness assistant. And I don't think many people who care about combat sports will spend a lot of time on them. But what's good about them is they are particularly cheap. And this will take a second, so I'll be back with you in a moment. Right, here it goes. It's a little bit high, but it will do. Now you'll see this moves quite differently. Like all the others, it's got a bladder inside. This is made out of some kind of rubber. Now, we're getting quite fast. And you see, I'm missing it already. So obviously, I need to practice more. I don't think you're going to fight many people who move as quickly as this. But it's fun. Maybe I should go back to the tetherball approach. You can use combinations. You know, you try to predict where it's going to go. I haven't used this a lot. Now, because it's cheap, it's made out of thin material, it won't last as long. But clearly, it's going to be quite good for you getting used to speed. Because it's light, you can probably let it hit you on the chin, and it's not going to do a lot of damage to you. The bigger leather ones, well, aren't really going to hurt, but you'll get a graze or two. One thing that's interesting about this, I'm not sure why, the other ones are far more likely to go straight. You really have to hit these just perfectly and it still goes off. Missed again. I'll come back in a couple of weeks when I can use this a bit more effectively. Now, as I say, this one, I think it was £17.99. Why don't you go and buy one of these on Amazon today, put it up somewhere and give it a try. If you do any kind of exercise at home, or even not at home, add this to it. Do the odd 10 minutes. You might just find it's enough fun that you want to do it a bit more often. Certainly gets you used to seeing something moving around quite fast and you don't want to come into contact with you. And I think it's good fun. This has been up perhaps 4 times, not left up in the sun. I'd be surprised if it lasts more than a year, but we'll find out. Again, I'll be back with you in a moment with another one. This one is by RDX, rather famous or infamous, depending on your experience with them. I've got equipment made by them. I've had some gloves that lasted a while. They're torso bag, and they're not very easy to buy anymore. And I've got this, and they last okay. I don't think anyone will ever try to tell you that RDX makes premium quality boxing equipment, but it's not bad because it's longer. It's going slowly. Perhaps that's quite a welcome relief after the speed of the last one. I don't really know why they made this shape. I think it's just, I don't think this is for a particular purpose. It just has a leather folding over the straps that might otherwise come from a central sphere. A little bit smaller. I usually have this over there, and it's on some bungees that are fairly slow. And if I'm having a fairly long session with a bag and the FC board here, then I take a break, cheating really. I go over there and just spend a couple of minutes doing this. Not a couple of minutes, that's an exaggeration. But I do it to get my breath back, and I think there's value to that. Of course, if you're in a fight, you're not going to stand and do that at any point in time. But if you need to get your breath back, you might be moving around, just using jabs to keep a distance. And I think it's a similar pace of exertion, and it will let you get your breath back. I think we know many people who go through 3-minute round, full intensity. I just thought something I didn't say earlier is to mention the name. I first saw them as floor ceiling ball. I think I first saw them on Amazon. I saw a video with a man who just spent a couple of minutes, all he did was punch it and slip. And I didn't really know what else to do with them. It took me a while to get the hang of using combinations on them. They're also known as double end bags. I don't call it a double end bag. Clearly it's not a bag. It doesn't matter at all, of course. I think Americans are more likely to call it a double end bag. I would think of a double end bag a bit more like the torso bag I've got that you can anchor at both ends, and you can use very similarly to this if you want to. But of course it's bigger, won't move as quickly, and you'll have a larger surface. It won't do the same sort of thing. There's just one more type to demonstrate, and this isn't such a minor difference. This one is worth being aware of. So, back in a minute. This is the real thing. And if somebody trains in a gym with a professional coach and with a lot of good equipment, they're more likely to have something like this. I got this one first. It's easy to use like this, just as a speed ball. But when it starts moving around, it's not very easy at all. You could loosen this up. It could very easily adjust the strap up there. You could use rope. Now then, this one I've had quite a while, unfortunately, although I've never left it out in the sun. These very thick cables, rubber cables, it's not really a cable, is it? Are beginning to decay. So, unfortunately, it's only got so much life left in it. But when that happens and they break, I'll just use heavier duty bungees. You can get bungees of all kinds, and I'm sure, I'm not going to do it now. I'm sure we'll have different types, but I'm sure some of these heavy duty bungees wouldn't be very different to this. You can double them up as well, and then of course they'll move a lot more quickly. Now this, you can use, just thinking of it as a target that's hard to hit. I think I've seen Manny Pacquiao doing that, and he was using one that wasn't moving out of a circle about 12-inch diameter, and you're using it for a different purpose then. But it's still difficult. Of course, you're training. I'm not going to question Manny Pacquiao. You're training your punching rather than trying to evade it. Although you still want to move out of the way of this sometime. But there's only so far it will go because this isn't anywhere near as elastic as the kind of bungees I was using earlier. I don't use it as much. Well, that was a very abrupt ending. Previously, through error, I've learned to make sure that the camera's charged and the microphone is switched on. What I didn't do was make sure there was enough space on the memory card. So I've lost 15 minutes or so of footage. Maybe it's a good thing because it was getting a bit long. Towards the end, I talked about some accessories you can use with the FC ball to make it a little bit different, a little bit more fun, and a few other techniques you can use when you're exercising with them. And I'll make a video on that in the future. The other thing I did wrong was have the microphone a bit too close to me, so every time I looked down and spoke, it made a horrible noise. Hopefully by the time you've watched the video, I'll have used audio editing to stop it actually making your ears pop. And in the future I'll be using one of these, which should solve the problem. Hopefully it will. To summarise, the FC ball I think is the single most important piece of exercise equipment because it's versatile, easy to use, easy to install, and as I always say, it's cheap. Before I go, I'll draw attention to this, which is something I put up about 8 years ago, and it's been up here ever since. So it's a tennis ball with a hole burned through the middle. You can heat up a knitting needle on a stove or a candle, and then it's got some electrical wire and half a bungee there and half a bungee there. And there's not a lot you can do with it. I use it to put the odd punch in or elbow because it makes sure I'm stretching after I've done other things. But you could easily have one of these hanging down towards the ground, and if you've got an old tennis ball lying around, a bit of wire and a bungee, you've got something like an FC ball for hardly any money at all. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon. My name's Mark. Cheers.